Hello and welcome to the Gilded Age, 1870s to the 1900s. Buckle up, because here we go. I hope you have your fill-in-the-blank notes in front of you. If not, go get them! Alright, I thought I would start off just comparing the Gilded Age to today. So back then, there was no Social Security. That's what SS stands for. So basically that's setting aside money after you retire. There was no Medicare, health insurance, no government regulation on big businesses, no antibiotics, airplanes, automobiles, computers, radio, and television. So I wonder what they did for entertainment. I'm sure plenty. Definitely not the same as today. Have all of these things today. Other things that might have been a little different. Government back then was extremely small, compared to today. So back then we had about 100,000 federal employees working for the government. Today we have 3 million federal employees, so we could say that government is huge or big today. There was no civil service system back then. There was no income tax. So government income came from taxes on imports, i.e. tariffs, and taxes on tobacco and alcohol. So today we have a civil service system. It's a good thing. We'll talk more about that later. And then income tax, yay. So the government gets their income from those taxes as well as tariffs, tobacco, and alcohol taxes. Other things that are different back then and today. Back then, in the 1870s, we were a rural society, meaning people were living in the country, as opposed to an urban society today, which is in the city. In 1877, the population of the United States was about 47 million, where, according to the census in 2010, the population of the U.S. was 320 million. Back then, there was only one city that was over 1 million people. That would have been, can you guess? New York City. And today there are over 10 cities that have over 1 million people. About 15% of the population back then were married women with 10 or more kiddos. 22% of the population had 7 to 9 children. Today, people per household is about 2.63. Don't ask me how you come up with 0.63, but there you go. Back then, about half the population was 20 years or younger. Today, half the population is over 30. We have a rate of natural increase about 3.3%, which is pretty steady. It's not huge. 3.3 is not a big rate of natural increase. Education. There were about 3 in 5 kids that went to school back then for about 80 days, where today it's mandatory that you must go to school up to a certain age, and you must go for 180 days. Most kiddos left in the early teens because they had other priorities or other responsibilities they had to take care of. Today, about 86.3% graduate from high school. Back then, only about 2.5% graduated from high school. Advanced degrees back then were almost unheard of, and we're talking about like master's degrees and PhDs. In 1877, only one master's degree was awarded. So 29.3% of the population has bachelor's degree or higher. Let's take a look at economy. Since after the Civil War, we started to transition from an agricultural society to an industrial society. So in 1877, the average urban income was $738 a year. They had about a 10-hour workday, at roughly 20 cents an hour. They did not have minimum wage like we have today. Minimum wage didn't come into effect until about 1924, and I think it was 25 cents an hour. Today, the average income for a person is $53,482. That's average. Okay, I don't even make the average. Generally, there's an 8-hour workday, and the minimum wage is roughly $8 an hour, which will probably change, I think, in the summer actually, and then probably eventually get up to at least $10 in the next couple of years. Today, about 14.8% people live in poverty. That's 46.7 million people. And today, the poverty threshold for a family of 4 is $24,230. So what that means is people who make that much money or less are considered living in poverty. I really wanted to talk about, maybe look at the issues of the day and compare it to the issues of today. So back then, the issues of the day were corruption in business and government, and huge displays of wealth from the rich, usually through material things. Exploitation of natural resources. This was at the beginning of the revamping of the Industrial Revolution, and people were just hacking down trees and polluting the air with all the coal that they were burning and mining all this stuff and not thinking about the consequences until really Teddy Roosevelt came in and was like, hey, we need to think about maybe leaving some stuff for future generations. Other things they thought about were the growth of, or had an issue with, this growth of corporate power and kind of unwielding and unlimited power for corporations. There was a gap between rich and poor, the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. Immigration was a big issue, which we'll talk about later. Divided politics and elections. They were pretty intense, and each political party had something major that they believed in. Morality was also something that was near and dear to them, specifically ideas concerning the distinction between right and wrong, or good and bad behavior. So we're talking about gambling and dancing and things of that nature. Looking at women's roles back then and the ability to vote or have a job, and equal rights, those kind of things, as well as drugs. So opiates were a big deal. Like heroin and eventually morphine, and cocaine was a big deal as well. Cocaine was part of Coca-Cola at one point, and the government thought, hey, this is probably not a good idea, so we should probably outlaw drugs in, consumables like Coca-Cola. So issues of today are the exact same thing, maybe just different aspects of it. So nothing new under the sun here. Alright, so let's start talking about the Gilded Age. What does that actually mean? Mark Twain was the person who came up with the term the Gilded Age, and it really refers to, a beautiful covering on the outside, like a piece of wood covered in gold. It looks really great on the outside, but the wood underneath is rotten. So when people think of the Gilded Age, and historians especially, they think of greed and guile, corruption, scandals in politics, huge consumption, like buying a lot of stuff. So it's really easy to say that it was a time period, a negative time period, but this is the time where we formed the rules of modern politics and business practices. So, yes, there may have been all this corruption, but the government and the people were like, okay, so we need to curb this, so here are the rules for these things. And so out of, negative things, positive things do occur. One of the things that they went after, or people looked at, was the attempt to enforce moral purity. And they passed things, some cities, some towns, some states passed blue laws which prohibited things that you could do that they thought were immoral or bad. For example, businesses being closed on Sunday. There shouldn't be any lotteries because that's gambling. No horse racing because, that could lead to gambling. Boxing, the same thing. Or even the manufacture of cigarettes because you could be addicted to something. In 1877, Utah forbid the sale of opiates for non-medical purposes. Which sounds vaguely familiar. I don't know. Medical marijuana? Maybe? So the largest movement was against, what they considered bad was alcohol. Specifically forbidding the manufacture and sale of alcohol. And one of the biggest groups that came out of this time period was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. In 1874, they began lobbying for an amendment to the Constitution to prohibit alcohol. Now, here to the right is a flyer to vote for a dry county or state or town. The other thing in this purity crusade was to exclude undesirable groups, and so we're specifically looking at immigration issues. So at this point, the United States was largely white and Protestant, and immigrants coming in started to become Catholic, and so they were coming in from the wrong side of Europe, basically. And then on the West Coast, we had Japanese, but mainly Chinese. And so the government started to restrict foreign immigration, specifically the Chinese. So to help curb some of the negative aspects of the Gilded Age, the government tried to implement some cost cutting and get rid of government corruption. So they looked at eliminating wasteful spending and actually having a budget that was balanced, meaning the money that you take in is the amount of money that you spend instead of having to borrow so much that you're in debt all the time. So one of the things that they proposed was to cut salaries of politicians. Oh my gosh. Yeah, that's been proposed since the dawn of time and is still being proposed today. There are lots of corruption going on at this time. One really huge ring of corruption, I guess you could find, was in New York City. An example of this would be New York spent $13 million on a county courthouse, and one of the line items said that they purchased one table and chairs to go with it for $100,000. And even today, that would be extremely extreme. So what's going on is whoever is contracting this, they're like, hey, we're going to pay for the table and chairs, and whatever's left over from the $100,000, we're going to put it in our pockets. So, which, of course, is illegal. So things like that were going on. Oh, watch the animation. Whee! There you go. So, also in New York, in New York City, there was a political ring called Tammany Hall, headed up by this guy, Boss Tweed here. He was in charge of the political stuff. And so the people are asking, who stole the people's money? Please tell us, from the New York Times. And so every single person who's part of the corruption ring is pointing to someone else. So no one is guilty. 'Twas him is the answer. And look who created this. Our friend Thomas Nast. So politics was a big deal in the Gilded Age. This was a time where voter turnout was higher than at any other time in American history. There's lots of negative things happening. People are going to go out and try to fix it. But you've also got to take into consideration there's a lot of voter fraud as well. So infamously, people would pay people to grow their beards out, go vote, go shave off their beard, leave their mustache, and then go vote again. Then shave off their mustache and then go vote again. They'd also register dead people and have people go vote as those dead people. So take that into consideration as well. This also was a period of time where the federal government assumed a higher or greater authority and power over things such as banking and currencies, taxes, tariffs, land, and immigration. So they're seeing these as new, maybe not so new, but bigger problems because population is getting bigger. And with more people come more problems. There are also highly politicized movements, specifically temperance, which you have read about earlier, when we talked about social reform. Temperance being about alcohol, women's rights, or the right to vote, as well as populist insurgency. And what that means is that the people are trying to take control and actually created their own party called the Populist or People's Party, and you can see that here. And they're trying to get things done. Even the farmers allied themselves to try to get better benefits from the government as well. So earlier we mentioned civil service reform, and if you have ever heard of the phrase, it's not what you know, it's who you know, that's what we're talking about. So it was extremely common for people, perhaps politicians or huge, big business people, to hire their friends, specifically friends that could benefit their business or to be reelected or whatever. And so people were tired of people getting hired just because they could benefit others, and they weren't getting hired for the quality of the work or their merit. So that would be a problem within our society if we have unskilled people in leadership positions, So they needed a way to find out if the employees, especially for government purposes, were actually qualified for a position. So the Congress actually came up with a Pendleton Act and created a civil service system, meaning that jobs should be awarded on the basis of merit through competitive tests. So you take a test, and depending on who has the highest score, which would mean or indicate that you're qualified for the job, highly qualified, then you get the job. And you can't be fired because of your political beliefs. So if whoever's hiring is Republican and the person they hire is a Democrat, you can't fire them for being a Democrat, because that's what was happening as well. And here is another political cartoon talking about the merit system for all government jobs, not just some. And this isn't anything new. It's been around for thousands of years. China had been doing it through Confucius. He suggested, the logical thing for government jobs is to have qualified people in them. So kind of one of the, the outcomes of looking at politics was, of course, political cartoons. The idea of Tweedledum and Tweedledee came about when or whoever wrote Alice in Wonderland, they were not the sharpest tools in the shed, so to speak. And they kind of applied that to the Democrats and the Republicans at the time, because at the time they almost had exact amount of strength, meaning they had balanced numbers, so couldn't really do a whole lot within Congress unless they all agreed. And that was difficult because they differed hugely on their principles. For example, Republicans, they really promoted national unity and modernizing the economy, meaning bringing new technologies to make our economy more efficient, and also looking at moral reform. Democrats, on the other hand, were pro-business, like pro-big business, and they also believed in the gold standard, which means that we needed to have enough gold to back up our greenbacks or our paper money. And they were against tariffs, and we'll talk about that later. But they were split on economic modernization. They weren't sure if that was going to be a benefit or not. So when you have the exact amount of strength within Congress and have hugely differing principles, then you're going to have big conflict and you might not get a lot done, which sounds awfully familiar in 2017. And to just kind of showcase that Tweedledee and Tweedledum have not left the building, there are still political cartoons being made today. This was in 2015, and I believe Senator Tillis and Senator Burr were on, one's Democrat, one's Republican, and they were talking about Loretta Lynch being nominated as Attorney General for the federal government. Alright, so in 1884 it was time to re-elect a president, and the Republicans brought forth James G. Blaine, and there should be an E here, of Maine. And the Democrats brought forth Grover Cleveland of New Jersey, and apparently these were really intense campaigns, and we are not immune to this. We've seen those intense campaigns this last year. We also talked about Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams being hugely competitive and negative. So it's really interesting because the Democrats came up with slogans against Mr. Blaine, and it was Blaine, Blaine, James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine. So apparently he's a liar with this catchy phrase. But of course the Republicans are going to come back with what they called the terrible tale, which had to do with Grover Cleveland and perhaps having an illegitimate child. And the phrase they came up with was, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" Unfortunately, Blaine had the Protestant clergy against him as well as the Catholics, so you pretty much just have no one backing you. So it was an easy win for Grover Cleveland. He became the 22nd and the 24th president, meaning the 23rd president came in and ousted Cleveland for a while, and that was Benjamin Harrison. And then he came back as the 24th president and did several things for the United States. He was the first Democrat after the Civil War. He was a bachelor when he was elected, but he married while he was in office and had children. In fact, one of his daughters they named Ruth, and you may have eaten a candy bar named after her called Baby Ruth. Grover Cleveland is known for creating or passing or helping get passed the Indian Emancipation Act, also known as the Dawes Act, and I would write that down. This was in 1887, and what this did was divide up land for individual Indians. So it looks like he's trying to help the Indian cause here. He helped lower tariffs, and he defended the gold standard. He also established departments of agriculture and labor, which are still in effect today. A huge question during this period of time was tariffs. We already have heard about tariffs, the tariff of abominations, and how divided people were on this issue. and it was an issue in 1887. The Democrats were not for it. The Republicans were for it. The Democrats said, hey, tariffs raise prices for the consumer. It only really benefits the wealthy, and it's very inefficient for government income. Republicans said, but the tariff promotes industry in America, and it already protects established industries. It helps raise workers' wages, and it gives us a rich home market for farm goods. So basically what they're saying is, if we raise tariffs for imports, people aren't going to try to come in here because they're so high, and that means that our farm goods will actually be purchased here instead of outside of the United States, and that's going to be good for us. But the Democrats and Republicans were split. And at this point, European manufacturers really couldn't compete with America, because by 1885, we became the world's low-cost, high-volume manufacturer. So our industry was soaring, and we were producing a lot at a cheap price. So it would have been, Europe couldn't really compete with us. And the only people that would really benefit from a high tariff were sugar growers, wool producers, leather hides, coal, timber, and iron ore. And if you take a look at this political cartoon, it's looking at the tariff question and not shedding good light on the Republicans. If you see the trunk here, which is a representation of the Republican elephant, and Grover Cleveland saying this about the tariff. It says, the public treasury becomes a hoarding place for money needlessly withdrawn from trade and the people's use, thus crippling our national energies, suspending our country's development, and preventing investment in productive enterprise, threatening financial disturbance and inviting schemes of public plunder. So he's saying this is what's going to happen if we have high tariffs. Last and certainly not least, another big issue, which is still an issue today, were trusts. In 1880s, there became an emergence of trusts in America. And basically what is are companies that bought out locally owned factories and merged them into conglomerates, which was huge business. And this created monopolies. And what that means is eventually there would be only one company that would sell a particular item. And if there's only one company out there, then what's going to happen is probably your prices are going to be jacked up and the quality of the product is going to be not good. Because if they're the only ones buying or being able to sell it, then you have to buy it, then they're going to make it however they want because they know that you have to come back to them. So this was a danger to democracy, basically, meaning you have no choice except for to buy from that one company. And the government was like, yeah, that's not a good idea. So Congress did decide to create some laws specifically for railroads called the Interstate Commerce Act. And it said the railroads must charge reasonable rates and they can't charge repeat customers less. I mean, you can't favor some people over another. Especially, this was going to harm the railroads were really cheating farmers, specifically poor farmers, who were having to pay the highest rates to ship their stuff. Another law that was passed was called the Sherman Antitrust Act, which made trusts illegal. This was in 1890. Probably the most famous case from this was the Standard Oil Company. One of my favorite political cartoons is this one, as it refers to the Standard Oil Company. So basically what they did was purchase smaller oil companies and created a monopoly, and as this cartoon points out, has its tentacles wrapped around even government. So Congress here, the Capitol building here, this tentacle is reaching for the White House. If you zoomed in, these people holding these pieces of paper says steel and copper, so he's already got his tentacles wrapped around this industry. And if you look up here, you see these ships being entangled with the octopus because the ships at that point were running on oil and the gasoline created from it. So when the Sherman Antitrust Act passed, they went after the Standard Oil Company and said, hey, you're going to have to break up into different companies, into companies that you know of today. It would be like Exxon Mobil. Actually, it was Exxon Mobil, and then they merged together. And then there was Texaco, Phillips 66, and others that you've probably heard of as well. Did I mention Shell? I think Shell was one of them too. And if you think that this wasn't a problem today, it actually has been an issue. Microsoft has been investigated by the Department of Justice as being a monopoly or a trust. And I like this political cartoon. It's a monopoly. It's the latest version. It updated for the 1990s when this was a huge issue. And when you open it up, it's about Microsoft and Bill Gates. But thank you, Apple, for being out there and competing with them. And other places like AT&T was trying to buy T-Mobile, and the government stepped in and was like, yeah, that's not going to work, because it started to look like it was going to become a monopoly and not work for them. Or for the people, really, is what the issue is. So, again, what could we draw from this? The things that were happening back then are some of the same issues that we're having to deal with today, maybe just different aspects of the issue. So, there you go. So make sure you double check your fill-in-the-blank notes that you just took. If you want to check your answers, go to the blue table up front. There's a purple folder, and at the back we'll have the answers if you missed any. Thank you for listening.